Yes, now we're joined by Dr. Modupe Adefeso-Olateju, who is the Managing Director, Education Partnership Center. Well, she advises public and private sector on how to design, implement, and evaluate partnership projects in education. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get your perspective on this raging controversy about when to resume, when not to resume, what to be done. What do you think of that?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I think that you're quite right in saying that this is a raging controversy because it really touches that which is important to people, and that is their children. And children are probably the most important factor in anyone's lives. The reality is that the country is still grappling with this Ebola virus issue. So on the one hand, we know that we don't have any official cases of Ebola virus, in the country. But on the other hand, who's to know if there's actually any unreported case still existing? We can't actually say categorically. So I do understand the perspective of those who are very concerned about the resumption date, which has been scheduled for Monday, the 22nd of September. My perspective is perhaps slightly different from the discussion. My perspective is one which, or should I say my concern, is that which I have observed over time in the education sector in Nigeria. And that is the fact that we do not seem to take education quite as seriously as we should as a country. If one were to ask, so what is the risk assessment strategy for the Ebola virus disease and its implication on education? Was anything done before we had the Patrick Sawyer incident? I doubt that we would have any sort of strategy in place, knowing fully well the sort of implication that this could have on the education system. And I think besides this, a big issue for me is how a situation like this can exacerbate the difference between public and private schools in Nigeria. We advise public sector, we also advise the private sector. And whilst a lot of parents in the private sector are still somewhat reluctant to allow their children to go to school on September 22nd, we have observed firsthand how proactive private schools have been in putting in place measures to ensure that, they can assess whether children, even have a high fever, or they can, wash their hands, sanitize. We've seen those measures being put in place. And of course, in some public secondary schools, we have also seen these measures put in place, but we can't say that categorically, across the country. So we're beginning to see even more of an exacerbation between what happens in the private sector and what happens in the public sector.
It looks as if we may even say further degenerate because, the leadership of the NUT, if I could rely on what he said, the private sector, those in public schools, I beg your pardon, were not private schools. They were not even allowed, they were not part of the key decision-making process for the demand that they're talking about now. And so it looks as though on Monday, September 22nd, the private schools may resume, while some public schools may not. So given that scenario, do you think this is what you're talking about, that this may just get worse?
I think this is the realization. And I think that it's very careless for people to sometimes say that, well, it doesn't really matter if children stay at home for 2 weeks. I'm an educationist, and I can tell you categorically that it is a very serious situation to have a child out of school for 2 weeks out of a term. It has severe implications on their learning outcomes at the end of the day. Ultimately, your health has to come first. Your health, safety, security must come first. But the realization is that, as you rightly say, we will see the vast majority of private schools open up on Monday. The kids will go to school, they will begin their studies, and we don't know what will happen in the public sector, if that will be the case as well.
I think you've weighed it both ways. You're looking at what is happening in the response of the private sector, the response of, government, even the response of the teachers as well. Would you say that this is just feeding into a paranoia?
I think it's a paranoia, and I think that one that on the one hand is justified because people are just not comfortable. People do not have a great deal of comfort in the level of preparedness that the country has shown toward the spread of this disease. It's great that we've been able to officially contain the virus, But how do we know categorically that we have no other Ebola virus case in this country? That is the perspective that a lot of parents have, and that is the perspective that I suppose the NUT has as well. And given that they're in the fore of this, they are the ones that have to go to the schools to mingle with children who have come from all over. One can understand their concerns. So I would not say it's paranoia per se. I would say that they are valid concerns. But nevertheless, the realization is that there are implications, and they are going to be quite severe for the children.
You know, the argument has actually gone on for some time, and I want to take a cue from what even the governor of Rivers State once said, right in the studios, asking about or closure of even markets. If these children, we know Nigerians are religious people, you know, we have seen a lot of them go to their Quranic classes, Sunday schools, churches and mosques. These same children that will be coming to school have been going out and going about. So how come we haven't actually had any concern concerning their going about until now that resumption is just around the corner? So it would amount to listening to what the government or the authorities have said concerning the last case that has just been out, and they say we are Ebola free.
I think that's a very important point that you make. And I think that that relates directly to the notion of responsibility. Now, when you go to church or when you go to a mosque, that's your personal decision. When government says school is resuming, that's no longer just your personal decision. That's something that the state has said, has taken responsibility for, and implied in that is that the state will take care of you. Implied in that is that the state is ready for you to go to school, which is quite different from going to a church or going to a mosque. And if you go to churches and a lot of mosques today, you find there's a lot of preparedness, and there are a lot of measures that have been put in place. I see lots of contactless thermometers all over the place. I see lots of, even in religious institutions where, you know, sanitary facilities were a bit dodgy. Now we see sanitizers everywhere. We don't know what's actually in the sanitizers, but they call them sanitizers, and they're in the bathrooms, and they're hand washing facilities, and water has appeared from nowhere. So I think it's a question of responsibility. And if government says schools have to resume, then the implication of that, or what is implied in that, is we're ready for this, and we can take care of it.
I know this argument at the end of the day will take us into standards of education, looking at the private and public sector, since you have observed that some of the private institutions seem to have been much more ready, like Boy Scouts, than the public schools. But again, if you look at it critically, what have you noticed in the public schools that you would want them to, well, touch up a bit concerning the EVD preparedness?
I think that the last speaker, the NUT Lagos chapter representative, made an interesting point when he talked about the Lagos Eco Project and how that has facilitated a level of autonomy at the school level. And what I mean by autonomy,
of the project?
Yes, I am. And I guess what we mean by autonomy is that now, on the basis of school development plans that school principals are supposed to develop, they have access to quite a substantial pool of funds. I think it's between 1.5 million to about 3.5 or 4 million on an annual basis, which they can use to sort of shore up facilities and infrastructure and even teaching services in their schools as they deem appropriate. Now, obviously, for schools that have that privilege, which is all of the secondary schools in Lagos State, I do expect that what they will do is they will budget for the incident of Ebola virus, you know, out of that. And so I expect that in all secondary schools in Lagos State, there should be chlorinated water, there should be contactless thermometers, there should be sanitizers, because they have a budget. So I think the core element there is that of how much agency are we actually granting teachers and schools? How much autonomy do they actually have in terms of their own decision making at the school level? How much autonomy do they have over their budgets? You know, why do they always have to wait for government, this big entity called government, before they can buy sanitizers or gloves in their schools? So I think the key issue there is how much autonomy are we actually promoting, and are we ready to embark on a level of decentralization so that these decisions can be made more rapidly at school level.
But you also spoke earlier of a risk assessment. You know, you talked about how you would have expected to see schools carrying out a risk assessment, or even the government asking, you know, what's the risk of this Ebola virus to our schools. I was listening to the Commissioner for Health in Ogun State, and he says that looking at the risk, he thinks it's infinitesimal, almost non-existent. If I'm interpreting him correctly, would you also say that?
I'm not sure that I would share that perspective, although I do respect that perspective. I think that the only way that we can do that, the only way you really do a good risk assessment is if you have some data. If you have good and reliable data that you're going by, and on the basis of that data, you can then make educated guesses or educated assumptions. So I think that unless we have actually gone out to a substantial or representative number of the Nigerian populace and taken their temperature and tested them, you know, unless we've done that, I think saying that the risk is that small I don't think I would say that.